questions at the end of all that. Thank you very much, and I will hand over to Mark.
Thank you, Deb, and to the Q Society for inviting me to speak tonight. I'm going to speak about a sensitive topic, and indeed, by its very nature, the material incites strong feelings, because it's a disturbing issue, and people's lives are deeply impacted by this in many ways all around the world. So this is not a subject that you would be expected to have no emotional response to. You should have an emotional response to it. However, my desire in speaking about it is not to incite emotions, but rather to explain why things happen, to get to the bottom of understanding the dynamics underlying what has been happening in different countries around the world. I think we're just waiting for it to come up. If you go up to play, Debbie, up at the top, and it'll be the first play slideshow. There we go. From Pakistan to the streets of Oxford, Islamic ideological foundations of the sexual abuse of non-Muslim women. Well, this is an issue. In the UK today, the Child Exploitation and Online Protection Centre produces an annual report. This is an agency set up by the police, and their 2013 report identified 65 groups that are sexually exploiting children across the UK. They asked all the different police stations, and these were the ones that they reported that the police knew about. And of these 67 groups, 57 are type 1, as they called it. These are exploiting young girls, particularly because they're vulnerable. They don't fit the profile of a classic pedophile group. Then there's type 2, 7 type 2, which are the classic pedophile group, and there's one street gang that the police were aware of. The 57 or type 1 abusers are identified by the police as 50% all Asian. There's 100% of the groups were Asian. Not all of the groups had their ethnicity identified, but where the police did comment that 50% that were all Asian, that's basically Pakistan, Afghani and so on. 21% of the abusing groups were all whites, and a smaller percentage were Arabs, blacks, and 17 were mixed ethnicities. 97% of the victims were white: English girls, Scottish girls, Welsh girls. So this is a extremely sensitive issue in the UK, because you've got basically Asian groups, mainly Muslim groups, and white, young, vulnerable girls being affected. The victims, the typical age of the victims, the median age is 14 to 15, but some as young as 12. It's an epidemic, really. There's the 2008 Manchester case. There were convictions. 9 were convicted of running a rape gang in which 5 white girls were identified as victims. Normally not all the victims come forward, so for obvious reasons. The 2010 Derbyshire case, scores of girls were groomed and raped by a group in Derby, and 13 men were charged. In 2010 in Oxford, 2013 in Oxford just recently, 7 Muslim men were convicted, and authorities were aware of this 6 years before the arrests were made. One girl was branded M for Muhammad, who was the man who owned her. He called her his slave. Also in the UK, there's an epidemic of taxi drivers raping. The police in London report that there are about 1,125 rape, sexual assaults involving taxi drivers a year in London. And in 2008, a BBC radio host, Sam Mason, she was sacked by the BBC for requesting a non-Asian driver to transport her 14-year-old girl, her daughter. The BBC said that the taxi company said that they didn't want to disadvantage Asian drivers or Muslim drivers, and the BBC said although Sam Mason's remarks were not made on air, her comments were completely unacceptable, so she was sacked for that reason. And there are repeated reports coming out in all these cases of police and social services being aware of the phenomenon and not acting against it again and again. This is the most inflammatory and difficult issue underlying the rise of the EDL, which is opposing aggressive Islam in the UK and conflicts within society in the UK at the moment. It's not just in the UK. Oh, this is a video.
Can you tell how old you are, please?
14.
And you go to a local school.
Yeah.
Have you lived in this area all your life?
Yeah.
You're having problems at school. Can you just elaborate on the kind of problems that you're having?
Asian boys coming up to me and saying, I'm going to rape you, and if you don't go with me, I'm going to punch you in the face with a knuckle duster, and if you don't, give me a blowjob.
And this is happening at the school to several girls, is it? It's not an individual case?
No, it's happening to lots of girls.
Do you think the teachers and the authorities are aware of this?
Yeah.
I mean, you're probably aware that the Edge of the City programme focused on young girls like yourself who are being targeted by Asians to be groomed in this particular area. Do you think that was an accurate description of what is happening?
Yes.
Have you contacted the police regarding them threatening to rape you?
Yeah.
And what's the police response has been?
They said that they're going to look into it.
And that is it?
Yeah.
What's your teacher's response been?
The pupils are going to get excluded for 15 school days.
Right, and that is it?
Yeah.
There's also the accusation that young Asian males are hanging outside schools in flash cars, basically intimidating young girls like yourself with threats. Is that the case?
Yeah.
And this is happening, what, once a week, twice a week?
Every day.
Every day?
Yeah.
And the authorities know it's happening, but they're not doing anything about it? How do you feel when you're targeted by these people?
I feel intimidated by them and scared.
So this is a phenomenon happening all over the country, involving thousands of victims and potentially hundreds of perpetrators. And the police and social services are aware of it and have been for years, and convictions are only now hitting the courts. It's a kind of crisis of how will Britain respond. But it's not just in Britain. In Denmark, this was years ago, in 2001, a study reported that 68% of rapists in Oslo were non-Western men, and Muslims were 5% of the population at that time. In Sweden, Sweden has the highest rape incidence in Europe. It's comparable to South Africa's rape incidence. And in a 2005 study, 85% of rapists are foreign-born. Notice the euphemisms, foreign-born, Asian. In the Sydney cases, in which a series of rapes led to a conviction, in fact, the newspapers reported in the early stages that there were 60 victims of similar gang rapes, but only a small number of them took their cases to court. It's interesting, the police reported in London that 1 in 10 of the sexual assaults involving taxi drivers, only 1 in 10 get reported, but 90% of them don't get reported. So the tip of the iceberg is what you're seeing coming to the courts very often. Now, this is the pattern across the West. The nationalities vary. They might be Moroccan, Afghan, Arab, Pakistani, Lebanese, as in Australia. Islam is a constant factor. It's the faith of most of the perpetrators. It's also not the faith of virtually all of the victims. I want to also acknowledge that not all rapes or gang rapes or gangs who rape are Islamic or come from Muslim countries. In the UK, 20% of the cases, according to the police, involved white groups, and we assume they were not Muslims. So this is not just limited to one group, but the huge majority of the problem is, and hugely disproportionately so, is involving the Islamic migrant community in European and other countries like Australia. There are other problems in the UK. There's a kind of pornification of contemporary culture and a lot of schoolyard sexual abuse of girls and so on. So there's a broader issue happening in the UK. Many parents don't know where their children are of an evening in the UK. Really shocking statistics about the breakdown of family life. So there's other things happening that increase the vulnerability of girls in the UK. There's other factors that are feeding in and making this more of an issue. As it happens, there are parallel reports that go back centuries of abduction, abuse, rape, kidnapping of non-Muslim girls in countries like Pakistan, Egypt, Iraq, Syria, and for example, since the revolution in Egypt, over 500 Coptic girls have been abducted, normally raped and then forcibly converted, married to one of their rapists. 1977 report of Jews in Iran notes that sexual abuse of women is common enough in Iran, but Jewish women are particularly targeted at that time because their men are not allowed to defend them. They're meant to be vulnerable. So that's just a report from a Muslim country from some decades ago. Now, this is a historical problem. With the harem, we know, everyone knows the word harem. The harem is made up of women who are not Muslims who've been taken captive in war. And that's how they're sourced, if you like. And in fact, the slave trade of sexual slaves was an important part of Islamic commerce, and more than 1 million Europeans were taken captive and enslaved from North Africa into Europe. Attacks on the countries in Europe. It had an impact on British foreign policy in past centuries, quite significant. The Marines had to go into Tripoli to stop American ships being attacked and their crews kidnapped and sold into slavery. It has a long history. In fact, the German academic invented the word Caucasian to refer to the white race because of the Turkish trade in white slaves. There was a kind of fetishization or an idealization of women from the Caucasus as the epitome of the white sex slave. So the term Caucasian originally derives from the white slavery, which was really generated for a long time by Islamic law. James Riley, an American ship's captain, he was enslaved in North Africa, and he reported, for example, in Morocco that the rape of Jewish women happens without the smallest restraint. So he's just observed that it was just common practice for men to go into the ghetto and rape Jewish women, and there was absolutely no recourse. In Iran, there's a long historic pattern of kidnapping of Jewish and other non-Muslim women. There are many, many reports through history which are documented in my book, The Third Choice, some of them, of mass rapes, attacks, for example, in Damascus in 1860, Casablanca in 1907. I think it was the French were shelling Casablanca. They were having an issue there. And as soon as that happened, the Muslims attacked the Jewish quarter for some reason. And one of the effects was that many women were raped and kidnapped. So it's a long history. This is a long history.